Presidents and prime ministers don't always get along. While we've had good relationships like FDR and William Lyon Mackenzie King or Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney, we have had some like Pierre Trudeau and Richard Nixon or John Diefenbaker and JFK. John Diefenbaker became prime minister in 1957 and he had a good relationship with President Dwight Eisenhower. The two found they had a love of fishing and both had Western farming backgrounds. Diefenbaker would later write, "I might add that President Eisenhower and I were, from our first meeting, on an Ike-John basis, and that we were as close as the nearest telephone." Thanks to that good relationship, Diefenbaker would approve plans to join the United States in what would become known as NORAD. When Eisenhower arrived for a visit to Canada, Diefenbaker shook his hand and stated, "Very happy to see you," to which the president responded, "Happy to be here." After addressing Parliament, Diefenbaker and Eisenhower went fishing together at Harrington Lake, which would become the official summer residence of the Prime Minister of Canada the following year. Now, if Diefenbaker and Eisenhower could be described as good friends, then the opposite would be the case for Diefenbaker and John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was typically quite cool with Diefenbaker and even invited Pearson to the White House as a Nobel Prize winner and met with him privately for 40 minutes. This greatly angered Diefenbaker, who saw it as a slight since he was the Prime Minister. Kennedy would make only one official trip to Canada, which he did from May 16th to 18th, 1961, and while it may have seemed from the outside to be a good and cordial visit, behind closed doors it was far from it. Things got off to a rocky start, with Kennedy announcing Diefenbaker's visit to Washington and his own visit to Ottawa, in which he kept calling Diefenbaker Diefenbaker. Diefenbaker had visited Kennedy in Washington in February of 1961, and Kennedy found him to be boring and was annoyed by his constant anecdotes. He would tell his brother Robert that he, quote, "never wanted to see that boring son of a bitch again." Kennedy would lobby privately with Diefenbaker to allow US missiles and nuclear warheads in Canada, something the Canadian public was very against. Diefenbaker was at first inclined to this, but after a mass petition arrived and a huge protest on Parliament Hill was organized, he decided against it. Kennedy also forgot a memo that detailed he would push the Prime Minister on several issues, including the warheads one. Diefenbaker then humiliated the American ambassador by showing him this memo. Diefenbaker would say of Kennedy, quote, "He's a hothead, he's a fool too young, too brash, too inexperienced, and a boastful son of a bitch." If you enjoy Canadian history, then check out my podcast, Canadian History X, available on all podcast platforms.